Cuba's ongoing challenges paint a picture far removed from the romanticized views many people may have of its historic city's colorful culture and revolutionary past. The reality is that the country, long held back by poor governance, economic stagnation, and political repression, remains locked in a struggle for survival. To fully grasp the dark side of Cuba, one must dig deeper into its troubled past, its economic woes, and the harsh realities faced by its people today. Cuba's political and economic situation has its roots deeply entangled in its revolution. After Fidel Castro's victory over the Batista government in 1959, Cuba underwent dramatic changes that initially inspired hope. The socialist revolution brought promises of equality, free education, and healthcare for all. However, those ideals were soon overshadowed by authoritarianism and centralization. Castro's government adopted a state-controlled economy, and private businesses were seized. This radical shift was coupled with a heavy reliance on the Soviet Union for economic aid, particularly in the form of subsidies for Cuba's sugar exports, the island's main economic driver. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba entered what is known as the Special Period, a devastating economic crisis that plunged the country into severe hardship. Food, medicine, and fuel shortages became widespread, leading to malnutrition and widespread poverty. The collapse of Cuba's largest trading partner exposed the fragility of its centralized economy, one that had failed to diversify beyond sugar and basic agriculture. Many Cubans were forced to survive on government ration cards, which barely provided enough food, and bicycles became a common mode of transportation as fuel became scarce. The economic stagnation from the Special Period has persisted into the modern day. Even now, the Cuban economy remains highly centralized, with state-run enterprises dominating most sectors, particularly agriculture, tourism, and energy. The government's efforts to liberalize certain sectors have been half-hearted and ineffective. The result is a country that struggles with chronic shortages of basic goods. Most Cuban families are forced to rely on the black market to obtain essentials like cooking oil, rice, and toiletries. Even worse, the average monthly salary of a Cuban citizen remains shockingly low, between $20 and $30. This income disparity is compounded by Cuba's dual currency system, which heavily favors those who can access foreign currency, leaving most of the population behind. The energy crisis remains one of the most pressing issues. The frequent blackouts or apagones have become a symbol of Cuba's decaying infrastructure. These blackouts are not only inconvenient but dangerous, as they leave hospitals without power and disrupt transportation and communication systems. The energy crisis is largely due to Cuba's dependence on oil imports, particularly from Venezuela. As Venezuela's economy has collapsed, its ability to supply Cuba with affordable oil has also diminished, leaving Cuba scrambling to meet its energy needs. This energy shortage highlights the broader issue of the government's inability to modernize and diversify its economy. The reliance on outdated systems and international aid has left Cuba vulnerable to global market fluctuations. Alongside these economic issues, the Cuban government maintains strict control over its citizens, limiting freedoms that are taken for granted in most parts of the world. Until 2013, it was illegal for most Cubans to leave the country without government permission. Travel restrictions were harshly enforced, creating a sense of entrapment for many who dreamed of seeking opportunities elsewhere. While the government has since lifted these restrictions, allowing Cubans to travel abroad with a valid passport, the financial burden of doing so is immense. With such low wages, few Cubans can afford the costs associated with obtaining a passport, paying for travel, and starting a new life abroad. Even within Cuba, citizens face severe limitations on freedom of speech and assembly. The government tightly controls the media, and dissent is met with swift retaliation. Independent journalists and human rights activists are frequently harassed, imprisoned, or forced into exile. This suppression of free speech reached a boiling point in July 2021, when thousands of Cubans took to the streets in unprecedented protests against the government. The protests were fueled by widespread anger over food shortages, power outages, and the government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Demonstrators called for libertad, or freedom, signaling a deep desire for political change. The government responded with a brutal crackdown, arresting hundreds of protesters and cutting off internet access to prevent the spread of information. Behind these public protests lies an even darker side to the Cuban experience: deep-rooted poverty and inequality. Although Cuba is often lauded for its healthcare and education systems, these public services have deteriorated significantly. Hospitals frequently lack basic medical supplies, forcing patients to seek care abroad if they can afford it. Education, while free, suffers from a lack of resources, and many schools are overcrowded. This decline in public services is particularly tragic, given that Cuba once prided itself on these achievements. Now, the dream of a socialist utopia has given way to a stark reality where the gap between the wealthy and the poor is widening. The poverty in Cuba is not just financial, but also mental. Years of government propaganda and censorship have created an environment where many Cubans feel resigned to their fate. The lack of hope is palpable. Even as the rest of the world has moved forward with technological advancements and economic growth, Cuba remains stuck in the past, unable to break free from the chains of its socialist experiment. Furthermore, corruption is rife within the Cuban government. High-ranking officials enjoy privileged lifestyles, while the majority of Cubans scrape by on meager wages. This corruption extends into every facet of life, from the black market for food and medicine to the bribery needed to access better education or healthcare. The government's refusal to embrace transparency and accountability has fostered a culture where those in power benefit, while the rest of the population suffers. Internationally, Cuba's economic challenges are compounded by the US embargo, which has been in place since the early 1960s. While the embargo is often cited as the primary cause of Cuba's woes, the truth is more complex. While the embargo has certainly had an impact, particularly on trade and foreign investment, much of Cuba's economic stagnation is the result of its own government's policies. The refusal to embrace market reforms, coupled with inefficient state-run enterprises and widespread corruption, has left the country in a state of perpetual crisis. What many people may not know is that Cuba has also become a major hub for human trafficking and forced labor. The Cuban government has been accused of sending medical personnel abroad as part of its international solidarity programs, but many of these workers report that they are forced to work in dangerous conditions for little pay, with most of their earnings being taken by the government. This exploitation of Cuban citizens is yet another dark facet of the government's control over its people. So, how did Cuba arrive at this point? Decades of centralized control, corruption, and refusal to modernize have left the country in economic and political disarray. While the revolution once promised equality and opportunity, it has instead delivered repression, poverty, and stagnation. Today, the Cuban people are caught in a system that has failed them, and while there are occasional signs of hope, like the protests of 2021, the road to true freedom and prosperity remains long and uncertain. Cuba's story is one of both resilience and tragedy. It is a nation that has endured so much, but it is also a nation held back by its own government's refusal to change. As the world watches, the question remains, will Cuba ever be able to break free from the chains of its past? Or will it continue to be a place where poverty, repression, and hopelessness reign supreme?